This is the LeaderShape Podcast. Our mission is to reverse engineer the leadership aspects of human peak performance. We are talking to accomplished leaders, maverick scientists, innovators and biohackers in order to unlock the secrets of long-lasting optimum performance and help people to achieve effortless success in their lives. The host of the LeaderShape Podcast is Imre Porkolab, the director of MCC's Academy for Leading Change.
Well, hello everyone. This is another episode of the LeaderShape Podcast, and we have a very special guest in here who is just visiting Hungary, Nigel Thurlow, that I'm going to have a fantastic chat with, I'm pretty sure. Nigel is the former chief of Agile at Toyota, creator of the World Agility Forum, award-winning Scrum, the Toyota Way, and this list could go on and on. Executive coach, you're working plenty of company stuff like that. If you had to, in 3 words, encapsulate of what you are doing, what would you say about yourself?
That's difficult, Imre. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. A disruptor, a problem solver. Maybe those are good enough words to start this conversation with.
You're also a Forbes top 10 rated author, and we're going to talk about the book later on.
Sure.
But why do you want to write another book? These days when there is plenty of agile and Scrum books, and what was the reason that you and your colleagues decided to write this fantastic book? By the way,
thank you.
And why is this, you think, different to the other books that are on the market?
So when I was at Toyota, I'd sort of spent some time developing what you mentioned, Scrum the Toyota Way, which was really a way to show that the agile sort of thinking and the lean thinking from the Toyota production system was actually symbiotic. And one's based on the other anyway. The roots of agile comes predominantly from the Toyota production system, but people were always seeing them as an either or, and I wanted to show them as symbiotic. And then as I started to sort of evolve my thinking and start to think, well, why are these things not working? What's missing? I started to realize there were lots of leadership books out there. You pick them up in the airport all day long and you throw them away when you get off the plane at the other end. There were some books on teamwork, but most of that was team building, less of teamwork. And then there was this thing called complexity thinking, which really clever people were writing about, but unless you had a really deep thesaurus lexicon in your head, you couldn't really understand it. So what I realized was we didn't need to abandon our lean thinking, our roots in TPS. We still needed this sort of agile way of looking at how we could solve challenges. But what was missing were these other elements. So complexity thinking, what we now call distributed leadership, which is empowered leadership, and also true teamwork based on team science. And the challenge was nobody had ever brought these together. And we were playing around with these ideas while I was still at Toyota, and I started drawing some squiggly lines to show how these things were interconnected and intertwined. It was actually Dan, who worked for me at the time, one of the guys who worked with me at the time. He walked by and he says, "I like your DNA structure." And this is when I suddenly got this idea. This is this triple helix, because there was these 3 key areas interconnected in this triple helix of DNA. And that was it. I realized it was actually bringing these things together. And people have told me subsequently that's helped them significantly understand what was missing, where the gap was. It wasn't an either or, it was a giant and it was a way of articulating how those things fit together and work together.
Yeah, we're going to go back to the book later on,
okay.
and we're going to dig deeper into complexity thinking, I'm pretty sure. But let's just go back to the roots and let's just recall, when you were working with the Toyota production system, what's the biggest takeaway, and what was it like, I don't know, a couple of years ago? I'm looking at you. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say numbers in here, but you can share details about, okay, how did Agile look, 20 years ago, for example?
Well, first of all, in Toyota, it didn't look like anything in Toyota at the time. The Toyota production system, if you really want to look at the essence of it, there's a couple of aspects. Empowerment of the people who are doing the work, and we can talk more about that, but also its behaviors. People always talk about copying Toyota or the tools of lean, and they always talk about things in reference of tools. They never actually think about the behaviors. And what you learn as part of being and Toyota's not perfect, trust me. Toyota's got a whole bunch of challenges just itself. And when you get away from the production line into the offices and administration and the sort of more traditional corporate world, you get all the same sort of challenges you do in most corporate companies, with the exception they've got this underpinning, this way of working, this philosophy, which is the Toyota way built on top of the Toyota production system, you can always fall back on. Where other companies don't have that, at least in Toyota, you can hold up the Toyota way book and go, but we're Toyota, so we should do it this way. And that works quite well at times. But the key thing that most companies do, or most organizations do, they copy the tools, what they perceive to be the tools. They don't copy the behaviors. And I've actually said one or two times that lean, or lean thinking, doesn't have any tools. It only has behaviors. And that, for me, from a Toyota perspective, is the biggest takeaway. There's many other things we could talk about, aspects of how Toyota function. The agile thing came a few years ago. And I was working with one of the creators of Scrum at the time, and we were working with some other organizations. And we got a phone call from Toyota in North America. And because of my background in Toyota in Europe, I knew quite a few of the people and who still remembered me, probably for good reasons, I hope. Maybe some one or two not so good reasons. And anyway, the conversation went, and a few months later, I found myself presenting to senior leadership at a leadership offsite for Toyota at the time, presenting the key concepts behind Scrum. But because I'd had years in Toyota, and I was able to sort of translate that, or at least present it in a language they understood. And this, I didn't know it at the time, this was really becoming the genesis of Scrum the Toyota way. How does this agile thinking and working fit with what Toyota does? And the similarities are so shockingly similar, and there's some nuances. And that sort of led to Toyota going, okay, we want to try and break the mold of traditional project management away from the production line, we're talking, and adapt or adopt some of these techniques and see how they will fit well with Toyota. Fast forward a couple of years later, consulting with them, and they hire me on, make me the chief of Agile. And now the legacy is that Scrum and Agile techniques are fully ingrained with some of the Toyota way of working, not extensively, not exclusively across the organization. Again, this is contextual. It's this thing, and we've talked about complexity later, bounded applicability, which we'll come back to probably now. But it's the fact that they have realized the power of doing things a little bit different way, but they don't disconnect from the Toyota way and the Toyota production system. And these things have become symbiotic. And in the right context, they're extremely powerful. Will we do Scrum, or will they do Scrum on the Toyota production line? Probably not. It's not the right tool for that context.
Actually, we definitely come to it's a great segue to complexity thinking. But I have two different follow-up questions beforehand. One is agility seems to be, it's almost like innovation. Everyone wants to be agile. So what do you think is agile and is not agile, and why the agile way of doing things, not in a strategic context, could be very dangerous for an organization?
So we're going to separate agile and agility. So agile is a philosophy. A bunch of guys, I don't know why it was a bunch of men, but it was a bunch of men some years ago, back in 2001, went skiing, probably drank too much adult beverages while they were skiing, got together in a room, and over a couple of days figured out some philosophical ideas which said this is a better way of working, hence the Agile Manifesto, yes. the 4 key values and 12 principles. So it's a philosophy. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It tells you these are some ideas we think it might be good to think like this. Agility is an emergent property of the way we work. It's not necessarily a specific methodology or a group of methodologies. It's just a reflection of how we work. So agility emerges. Many other things are emergent within the way we work. And so I separate the two. Now, once you separate them, there's lots of tools and techniques, methods and approaches which enable organizations to solve their challenges. Most often just how we work together and collaborate and communicate and solve problems together. And then you get this idea of agility emerging within the organization. It doesn't mean the philosophy is wrong. There's some fantastic points in the Agile Manifesto, and they give us a guiding light. But most organizational change, if you like. I hate the word transformation, but most organizational change starts with an alignment to some sort of philosophy, a shared mental model, a shared belief in something. And then we start to learn how we craft our behaviors to achieve some of those philosophical ideas or ideals, and then we get an emergence. And then things like mindsets, which are very personal to individuals, evolve and emerge. We can't sort of walk into an organization and say, here's the agile mindset. And they all do this. From this point forward, thou shalt believe in the agile mindset, thou shalt change the way you think. It's complete nonsense, because our mindset is our worldview. It's how we interpret all the external inputs in our world. And what we can do is we can create an environment, we can facilitate an environment, encourage certain behaviors, and then hopefully the right worldview will emerge, just like agility will emerge.
Is this a radically different approach to strategy? And that's my second follow-up question on this one, because emergence as such is very different from the very, very hierarchical top-down approach that many organizations are looking at strategy.
The problem with strategy, I went and Googled because I knew you were going to talk about this, so I went and Googled, or I assumed you would, I Googled the simple definition. All strategy is a plan to achieve an outcome.
Yeah, it's a play.
So at the end of the day, now people have all these think tanks and these strategic sessions, and people get into all this sort of different types of leadership. But the reality of it is we want to achieve some form of outcome. Now, for years, we've determined that outcome, and then we've made a plan to achieve it, and the plan was rigid and fixed and inflexible and forced in many occasions. And anybody who's ever gone through project management, program management will have lived this story. The outcome is really what was believed was going to be the outcome at the beginning. And indeed, many things emerge because we're working often in at least very complicated, if not complex scenarios. So therefore, this notion of predetermining an outcome in a very large, complex organization, potentially with very large, complex sort of things we have to solve to achieve this outcome, is actually just delusional. And these ideas of 3 and 5 year plans are becoming dated notions. Now, companies still do them. And there's nothing wrong with a roadmap saying we're going in this general direction. Hopefully in 5 years we'll be the number one, blah, 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 in our sort of line of work. But to actually try and map out a detailed plan for more than a few weeks or a few months at best is really fraught with lots of problems. So we can still have these objectives if we want to achieve these outcomes. And people talk about the North Star or setting the true north. And Toyota have this idea of true north as well. But that changes. Just like the magnetic pole moves, so does your true north. So we set this direction, this roadmap, the direction we're going to go in. And as we iterate in whatever way we do this, PDCA or Scrum or some other words, we iterate towards this, incrementally trying to achieve it. We learn things on the way and our strategy changes. You're a military guy, and the famous phrase from Eisenhower all those years ago, and I did look up the source of this, it's a true phrase that, plans are useless, but planning is everything. And he was talking more or less, and he didn't actually come up with that phrase originally. He was actually paraphrasing or using it he'd heard in a previous speech. But his idea was that we plan for a certain outcome, but we need to be flexible to change our plans, change our direction when we realize the outcome is unattainable, or that we've learned things on that journey which makes a different outcome more favorable. And that's the piece that companies are now trying to bring in. And we use this phrase, weak signal detection. How do you know what you need to know before you need to know it? So if you fix something so rigid and so inflexible, when you start iterating or start building towards this outcome, if you've got no ability to learn from what you're doing and change direction, you miss the weak signals and bad things happen.
That's right. And we have come to complexity. I mean, you just built this up. And I know that you're working with Dave Snowden and others closely.
Indeed.
Just to name drop in here. But obviously we and every organization feel that the world is becoming more unpredictable, more uncertain, hence the phrase VUCA world. And it seems that this emergent type of strategic approaches, let's stick with strategic approaches, seem to be the magic potion that everyone is looking for. How a complexity thinking combined with team science can help even large companies to navigate in a more unpredictable and uncertain context.
So you're right. I'm very lucky to know Dave and to have been privileged to work with him. And in fact, we've done some writing together recently together with Professor John Turner, who's one of the other people behind the work we've done, along with, I'll give Brian Rivera a shout out while we're talking, just to be fair to include everybody. But complexity thinking helps us to understand things that are not predictable, things that are not ordered, linear in linear causality. So the causality isn't linear, one thing following the other. So it helps us to understand the world that is less predictable, less ordered. Now, I come from a lean Toyota manufacturing background, predominantly. I've done other things, but I have this as part of my DNA. So in that world, we like things that are very linear, very predictable, very ordered, very leveled. We don't like high variation. We don't like unpredictability. Now, that happens, but it's usually reasonably well controlled. But we have this world which is tremendously unpredictable at times, not only in world events and things like the pandemic and things of that nature, where we sort of extremely, and I'm sort of visualizing Dave's work in Cynefin now for the people who are listening, but we start off in this sort of world of this abject confusion and this state of aporia, and then we sort of drop into sort of a chaotic state where we really don't know what to do. And when we're confused, we just have no idea. We get into chaos. We then start to realize that we need to do something and just see what happens, just act in some way. And then gradually, as we start to use sense-making capabilities and other tools to try and understand the landscape we're in, we start to get a little bit more management of the problem we're in, and then we're into this complex world. Now, the challenge with complexity, again, from my lean thinking background, there's no simple root cause analysis. There's no 5 why analysis, a nice single root cause, fix that, few countermeasures, and we're good to go, which is my lean world. And so we start to need to understand these tools and these techniques, and this agile and scrum sort of world sort of fits somewhere in between these two areas in this sort of what's known as a liminal area, liminal zone. And they can help us when things become a little bit more unpredictable. We need to do a little bit more experimentation because we're in the complex world. We're looking for safe to fail experiments. We want to probe and sense and respond.
If we have time for that.
If we have the time for that, we use the words even. If we don't have the time, maybe we're in chaos and we're just acting and hoping for the best and seeing what happens, yeah? So that gives us some of those techniques, but there are other techniques in there from the sense-making world. Things like actually talking to people and listening to them and getting their stories and their narratives and understanding what they mean and giving them ways to express themselves in a very psychologically safe way, which gives meaning to their experiences over time so we can understand how to act differently and to make sense of the world we're in. These are techniques that all organizations should learn because the best weak signal detection array are the people within that organization, and even those informal networks beyond the boundaries of the direct employees of the members of the organization. And this is crucially important because people are making strategy, plans, predictions, outcomes or whatever, but they don't truly understand the landscape. And so there are things that if they better understood the landscape by sensing, humans then make better decisions, better planning. Exactly. Yeah. So that's where complexity thinking starts to think, at least from my perspective, which is where I'm more focused on organizational design and organizational chaos and trying to help predominantly commercial corporate organizations feel their way in a better way and plan more effectively and execute more effectively.
You travel very, very extensively. And what do you think? What are the best leadership practices today that a leader can strive for in order to be better able to solve these problems? And do you have any good examples that you can share, for example, with
Well, as we're recording this in Hungary at the time, there is one company I've been working with, and I can tell you that their understanding that they've developed of what it means to lead differently with these different practices, be it complexity thinking or more empowerment, which is this distributed leadership sort of focus that we have from the work we've done. but also to understand what this truly means and how to plan better has actually been exceptional. I'm truly privileged to have worked with them recently, and some of the things they've done, it's taken me a long time to see senior leaders actually do that. And I'm not just talking about the simple practices of creating safe-to-fail environments, and psychological
it's not the beanbags
safety.
in the offices.
Yeah. I mean, we've got beautiful, the building is beautifully decorated, but we're talking about creating an environment where people feel they can experiment, they can try things out. Also recognizing that people are constantly overwhelmed with just so much work to do, and the recognition that they need to create the space and they need to be less ambitious in some of the things they need to try and achieve. And it's always a competition between how do we innovate, how do we create the space for innovation, creativity, new ideas that nobody else has thought about. At the same time, how do we achieve the needs and the desires for the customer experience, that set of products and services that we need the customer to enjoy and buy more of, because that's what creates the wealth.
Are you talking now about the difference between the task work and the teamwork, or that's a different sort of aspect?
We're heading in that general direction. So, but there's this. So leaders are constantly on this balancing act. They've got their internal objectives, they've got the external needs of their customers, of the people who enjoy their products and services, and they've got the needs of the people who work for them. They're not just the employee engagement, but the employee health and well-being. So there's this constant balancing act. So good leadership understands all those different dimensions, understands the tools and the techniques that are within their context to enable them to actually work more effectively and to lead more effectively. And then to segue nicely into team science. And when we start talking about teamwork, task work is the act of doing stuff, making things, doing things, checking tasks off a Gantt chart, a to-do list, Teamwork isn't about team building. This isn't going to an escape room and, escaping the mummy's curse or something and all going for beers afterwards, which is all great fun and helps build relationships, but it's non-contextual. So how do we find a way to train teams within the context that they're in day to day, in that environment, which causes them to behave and work in certain different ways? And I'm talking about collaboration, communication, conflict resolution, the understanding of shared direction, shared mental models, the understanding of what our abilities are, which we call shared cognitions, and this type of thing. And how we enable people to identify actually whether they need to be a team versus, because the problem with the agile world is they rush in and they immediately tell everybody, right, we're in this team-based structure, and we start booting up squads or teams or some other notion of collection of people, but they don't actually understand the work they do. They don't actually examine the work they do, and they don't determine whether a team is the appropriate approach. We have a lot of work that's dependent. Don't need a team for that, need cooperation, not necessarily collaboration. We have work that's independent, so by definition it's isolated, doesn't need to be connected. And we have work that's interdependent, which is where we need the collaboration, where the people must work together. And I'm afraid that nuance is lost on a lot of people who go into roll out these agile working practices and these team-based structures, and actually they use the wrong tools in the wrong context, and people naturally get confused and stressed. The other side of it, from back to the leadership side, where this is where we get the intersection between the leadership and the team science, is that these leaders need to work together and learn teaming skills. And quite often, most of the problems in organizations I go in to look at and to try and solve are actually nothing to do with methodologies. Teaching them Scrum or some agile technique or some other technique isn't actually going to help them. What they need to do is actually learn to collaborate and communicate more effectively, because the problems within the organization are normally in these siloed boundaries between different parts of the organization, and we need people to communicate horizontally across them. And just because we go teach them how to do Scrum or use a Kanban board or something, doesn't solve that problem. It's just never going to solve that challenge.
And sort of the highest level of team collaboration that I've seen is I call it group flow. Mm-hmm. And we have come to flow, which you're the CEO of the Flow Consortium. So what does flow really mean to you, and why did you pick this name?
Well, I guess because everybody else had picked all the other names and we thought that flow was the next thing. And I can guarantee you'll see all sorts of nonsense like flow masters and flow guides and all sorts of other nonsense coming out in the next few years. We looked at various aspects of flow. And of course, I'm in Hungary, so we've got Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and I hope I pronounced that correctly.
That's correct,
Lots of practice. And so the construct that he came up with about psychological flow, which most sports people know about being in the zone, which is how do we keep people in a high state of awareness without apathy or boredom, but also without fear, and keep them in that zone. And so sports teams are aware of that. And if you see your elite sports people who are, whether it's racing drivers or people who run or whatever they do, you see them, they get into that zone when everything else fades away. So the first thing is, how do we get people into that zone within the working context or in the organizational context? Then we looked at constructal law from Adrian Bejan, and he starts to view everything as a living system, a flow system, whether it's a river, a human, or something else.
Biological organization.
Yeah, whatever. So you start, and then we start to look at the social construct, which is very closely aligned to Mihai's work in sort of, being in the zone. And more recently, we're looking at constructal law. There's a new paper out, constructor theory. So we've got the new paper out based on constructor theory. And that's given us even more clues and more work we've done on information theory and about information being the key to life and the flow of information being absolutely critical, not just in our own existence, but in how we build, run, and establish organizations and within everything that we rely on and that we need.
Sustainability things.
Yeah, exactly. And so the concept of flow, and I make very clear, flow is a construct. It's not a methodology. It's not a framework, although some people will create such nonsense. The flow system is a system of learning and understanding. It was never meant to be a prescriptive framework or methodology of any description. So it's there to help people understand these different constructs and to choose what works in their context. But for me, flow really truly is about how we create and sustain our very existence, and all the research and the science that my colleague Professor Turner has spent eons studying and researching to help drive some of the work we're doing is taking us closer and closer to that. And one of the key phrases I learned recently is energy follows information. And this part of the paper we wrote recently with Dave Snowden. And so what we're trying to do is reduce the cost of energy by improving the flow of information, whether that's in a personal construct, whether it's in a social, an organizational, greater construct. And so that's where a lot of the work is now heading. And I think Mihai had it right in his work in Hungary. And I think that, these various different experts that have talked about flow had it right, and we're gradually understanding more about this. And I think this is also a universal construct that doesn't rely on a specific methodology, a specific tool or framework to achieve. It's just a construct. And if we can use what works in our own context, and the flow system helps guide some of that, it's not exclusive, it helps guide some of that, then I think we'll actually achieve greater things. And I think organizations need to move away from prescriptions. Just like we can't have 5-year plans, we don't need big consultancy models to tell us how to actually function. What we need to do is understand the world within which we live in, the sense-making, the environment we're in, and find ways to improve that.
And how to make interventions. And that's just great, because, the book, when I was reading it, and I had to reread it several times.
Yeah, I apologize for that. It's not meant to be bedtime reading.
Yeah, because this is one of the most comprehensive sort of, navigational tool maybe in this VUCA world that I have ever picked up. And for those listeners who are curious, this is going to be published in Hungarian very soon. So
I really hope so.
We are all very excited about that, and hopefully we can welcome you back for a book launch event later on. But I'm sure that you are thinking about a follow-up things as well, not just papers but maybe books as well. Can you just share some details about where this is headed?
So when Nigel finishes writing the small sections on lean thinking to complement the massive work that Professor Turner's done on the other elements, the flow system playbook will be out sometime in the next 3 or 4 months. The playbook isn't, I'll confess to your listeners, the playbook is a bit of a clickbait because the playbook is not a prescription, but it's a guide. First of all, it's designed as a learning guide. John's put a lot of work, Professor Turner's put a lot of work into making it something that can be used as a self-study guide. So beyond the heavier academic book that you mentioned a moment ago, the original book, this book will help people learn a little bit deeper, and there's a lot of exercises, there's worksheets, there's going to be QR codes to download assets from the website. We're tying it in very much with the work that Dave Snowden's doing with some new sensemaking kits he's releasing, and you'll see a little bit about that coming out in the near future. He's launching those imminently. So we're going to create complementary, and these little hexagons, just for people to visualize, these little hexy kits or kits of hexagon shapes which you can interconnect and interlock to find different patterns that might work within your context. So a really great visualization tool. Dave's tentatively calling it estuarine mapping. Wow. So look for that when it comes out very, very near future. And he'll be speaking in the Netherlands in a couple of weeks' time, same day as I am when we're talking about flow. So the playbook will come. The playbook then will also be a practitioner's guide. So all the tools and techniques we think could be useful in various contexts, there will be the how-to guides. How do I use them? If I want to do Wardley mapping from Simon Wardley's work, what does that actually mean? Why would I use it? How would I use it? And how could I apply it? If they want to learn some of the sense-making techniques that were developed by Dave with the Conneving companies that's now known, that type of information will be in the playbook. So that we think will be a significantly good contribution or a partner to the original book. But it'll be also, as I say, this self-study guide with lots of materials to help people apply and understand these techniques without the deep academic background or the deep dive. Later in the year, hopefully by late fall, late autumn, we are working on a collaborative book with Dave Snowden. So Professor Turner, myself, Dave Snowden, which I can't tell you too much about, but it will be decision-making in complexity. Okay, and we are going to advance the work of some of the people who dig a lot of deep work in decision-making techniques. We believe we have a new model. We believe we have a significant body of work which will advance how we make better decisions in complex use. I use the term VUCA, but in these complex scenarios and these sort of very volatile, uncertain sort of worlds. And so we're hoping that will be out by about the autumn, so I don't know, September, October-ish time later this year. So that's my writing duties for this year.
Wow, that's plenty, especially that I know that you're doing plenty enough, of consulting and other things on the side as well. Are you looking at military examples as well? Because we know that, militaries, they have been looking into this sort of problem set for centuries now. And especially mission command is rooted in militaries, even though that the new reincarnations, no matter how, distributed leadership, how this is called, is applicable in civilian contexts as well.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned Brian, or I mentioned Brian earlier on. So Brian, or Ponch as we call him, Rivera, he's he's still involved in the US Navy on the reservist side in the US, of course, but he's an ex-F-14 naval aviator. So he's worked in some of the most VUCA environments, and he brought a lot of his skills from the high-performance team point of view, the crew concept type of work within his context. But of course, he also introduced a lot of the work that people like David Marquette had done with Turn the Ship Around, sort of commander's intent. We rephrase commander's intent to leader's intent, same idea within the flow system, because we wanted to tone the language a bit for the business world. That was really why it was done. But yes, we're constantly looking at that. But I keep seeing examples in the military world, and examples, was it Nicholas Briggs? I forget his name, but there was the guy who was leading the agile transformation for the US military, and he resigned in this big blaze of glory and sort of said this would never work for all these different reasons. Because the US military specifically are still very much working on this command and control, very fixed, very rigid thing. So even with the examples of Dave Marquette when he commanded submarines and he changed this entire dynamic that I forget the number of 120 odd people on his boat, thinking, acting, behaving like they were the captain of the submarine. And he created this fantastic environment, which we, of course, have influenced our work significantly in various different types of decentralized management and leadership and true empowerment. Because the difference between delegation and empowerment, when you empower somebody, you actually give them the ownership, the accountability. When you delegate, you still keep the final decision. But when you empower, you relinquish that decision making and you trust the people beneath. And there's another word, trust, which has to come into that. Yeah. And so and I often say to leaders, if you don't trust your people, you've got a different problem you need to solve first. Forget all the rest. Go figure out why you don't trust the people who work for you. So there's a huge amount of challenges to do there. I think there's lots of lessons. I mean, people quote all the way back to Sun Tzu and people like that. You know, there's all these sort of work of people who lived hundreds of years ago, which still apparently influence and are talked about a lot. But I still think there's a huge challenge there because military forces, by definition, are command and control. I'm in charge, you do as you're told. And I'm in charge to a certain level, and I do as I'm told with the next guy up the chain. And now I know that, in books like Team of Teams, of course, there's famous examples of how...
Yeah, but that's special forces. That's a different culture.
Yeah, indeed, because, I mean, that's decentralizing and making decisions. And indeed, if you're in a hostile environment and you need to make a rapid decision, you can't wait for the command chain to make that decision for you. But then why in business can't we make those decisions tactically? Why is it we have to wait for the command chain to approve? Now, in the book and in the work we do, we call that enabling constraints. We've got inhibiting constraints, which are these strict rules. Thou shalt not do these things. If you speed, you'll get a ticket. I've learned in Hungary, if I drink alcohol and I drive, even one drop, I'm in trouble, yeah? Whereas in America, you might have a little bit of latitude, yeah? A little bit. Don't drink and drive, folks. Bad idea, ever. And so you've got these, but you get these enabling constraints which say, hey, we will allow you, the agents in the system, everything within the system, to move freely within these guardrails, these enabling constraints. But organizations struggle with that concept because they don't want to lose control. There's this whole idea that I've been promoted into a certain position. I've now got this ownership and responsibility. And if I empower other people, even with these enabling constraints, then I'm scared that I'm going to lose control or they'll do something bad.
Or I'm not needed.
And there is that. I often joke about the Peter principle, which I don't know if you've heard, leaders get promoted to their level of incompetence. And so they're now clinging on for dear life. They don't want to relinquish this control of this or delegate even, never mind empower, because they're afraid that if they're not controlling everything continuously, then their role and their role in the system will diminish. But they then become the constraint in the system. They are the organizational constraint. So a lot of the work I do with leaders is to try and break that sort of type of thinking and get them to see themselves as a valuable part of the system. And their role is to remove these constraints, not create and retain them. And that's, I think, something that the military could probably learn from the corporate world, just as the corporate world are learning some of these, special services techniques. And it's not, you've got to remember that, one of the creators of Scrum came from a military aviation background. So you can imagine there's some of that small team, fast decision-making thinking built into some of the thinking that he put into that process.
And just so many nuggets that we are uncovering here. I could do this all day. Unfortunately, we are nearing the end of this podcast episode. But maybe for the last question, you have worked with MCC students in here. And then from this wealth of knowledge that you're sharing with us, they could learn from you as well. And I know that they were very happy to do that. What's your reflection on that one? How was it working with the MCC Leadership Academy?
It would... Truly, it's been a lot of pleasure, a lot of fun. And I actually learned from your students last time I was here. I was lucky enough to spend a couple of days with different groups. And I first of all learned presenting with PowerPoint is a waste of time with this younger generation. They want to be, whilst I still think there's a need for them to learn the theory and they understand the why behind what we're doing, they're much better suited to experimenting, to trying things out, to being challenged to actually do rather than just listen or, learn parrot fashion, rote learning from slides. And so I had to actually adapt what I was doing with them. And I told them at the time, and I got a much greater response. But what I realized with your students as well as with others I talk to, the level of knowledge and capability they have, even at a young age, is just incredible. And we need to nurture that, and we need to support that and promote that. And I think you've got some incredibly bright, clever, exciting people. I look back at the photographs of when I was here, and I have big smiles on my face when I remember some of the characters I met and some of the things.
They've set a world record, right?
Yeah. So we did a teaming exercise, and we use these sort of planks you have to put together rapidly in this big puzzle format. These are sort of desk-sized chunks of wood, and all the teams exceeded any result I'd ever got with, let's call them, more mature people in my classes, typical executives, managers and things. And one of the teams just smashed it. It's like 11 seconds. Nobody had ever done it that fast. 24, 25 seconds was the fastest. And I still use that little snippet of video to show people how phenomenal they were. And that was teamwork training. They learned to team. I mean, I will confess that one of the teams had some industrial engineering type students in the team, and they were just phenomenal. I mean, one lady, she worked out, I give them a fake plan to begin with, and she sussed it within a few seconds. She knew what I was doing. So she just ignored a lot of what I was saying and figured it out, and they were phenomenally quick. But the interactions, the communication, the collaboration there, the problem solving was phenomenal. And if we can take that and implant that into the organizations that we coach and support and we train, then the future might be a bit brighter.
My very last question would have been, what's your message to this young generation? But you already answered that. So thank you very much, Nigel, for being here with us on the LeaderShape Podcast. And we hope that we can welcome you back, and then you can spend some more time with MCC and in Hungary as well.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.